Today on ATP, the Great Debate. Do the Jews have a right to the land they call Israel? Stay tuned today for all of your answers. Well, hello again, everyone. Ed Walsh here at Appointed to Promote Television, where, as always, I cover for you current events via the biblical lens. And today, I look to welcome you to part 2 in my new multi-part series I've simply dubbed Israel versus Palestine, Separating Fact from Fiction, where the fiction provided today is the Jews are land thieves and colonialist occupiers who have no claim to the land they call Israel. But here are the facts. For the phrase, from the river to the sea, is the creed that has been heard around the world in protests against Israel for their so-called occupation of the land.
From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
For Palestine and Arabs alike insinuate that the history of the Jewish people in the land of Israel did not begin until 1948, and therefore a Jewish Zionist state has colonialized a region that they claim has always belonged to them, and of which we also see the words occupation deceptively applied to Israel in various newspapers, in countless media platforms, to international leaders and elected officials who at best unthinkingly parrot these tired mantras about Israel, and at worst are actively working in the effort to wrestle away the Jewish homeland from the Jewish people by verbally rewriting their history and denigrating the very Jewish state of which I will give you one prime example shortly in the program. Now, I proved that these claims were complete fiction in part 1 of my series. Therefore, please check out the link above or the link in the description box of this program for the program in its entirety. Although I can save you some time by telling you, the facts are that the Jewish people have had the title claim to this land, of which has been fought over and sought after for nearly 4,000 years, and of which I will continue to prove in this series by again doing so historically, archaeologically, and yes, most importantly, biblically. So the question is, where did it all start? Well, that was with a man named Abraham. And that was in what was known as the Abrahamic covenant, as told to us in Genesis chapter 12. For it was this threefold covenant where God promised Abraham blessing, a great name, and nation, and of which ultimately led to Moses leading the Israelites out of slavery from Egypt, to Joshua leading them into the very promised land of Israel around 1400 BC, and to eventually be followed up by the establishment of the capital city of Jerusalem via King David 4 centuries later, as well as 2 Jewish temples to follow. Now, it wasn't always paradise, however, for the land was split into 2 nations around 975 BC after the death of King Solomon, one being the nation of Israel and the other being the nation of Judah, which were then followed by the successful invasions from both the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And don't forget about the roller coaster relationship between the God of Israel and his Jewish people, and all due to their disobedience and worship of false gods and idols. This ultimately led to the God of Israel himself dispersing his nation's inhabitants, as we're told in the book of Leviticus. You, however, I will scatter among the nations and will draw out a sword after you, as your land becomes desolate and your cities become waste. And that's just what happened, as in 70 AD, the Roman Empire destroyed both Jerusalem and the Second Temple under Titus' army. And at that point, the Jewish people were scattered across the nations for the next 2,000 years. Now, as mentioned in part 1 of my series, it was a Jewish uprising in the year 135 AD, which was brutally suppressed by eventual Emperor Hadrian. And thus, in an effort to demoralize the Jewish people and detach them from the land, Hadrian renamed the region Syria Palestina, again after the Jewish nation's two most formidable biblical enemies, that being the Assyrians and the Philistines. And this is where the term Palestine first entered the modern debate. Now, a common misperception was that all Jews were forced into the diaspora by the Romans in 70 AD, only to then see the Jews return to Palestine 1800 years later, thus demanding their land back. But in reality, the Jewish people have maintained their ties to their very homeland for more than 3,700 historic years. For even after the Second Temple's destruction and the exile's beginning, Jewish life in Israel continued and even flourished from the 9th to 11th centuries, and in what was known as the Four Holy Cities, those being Jerusalem, Hebron, Zaphat, and Tiberias. However, the Crusaders' massacre of Jewish communities in the 12th century temporarily slowed their growth, but it was by the early 19th century, and years before the birth of the modern Zionist movement, that more than 10,000 Jews lived in what is now known as the Nation of Israel. And the 78 years of nation building that began in 1870, well, it culminated with the reestablishment of the Jewish state in 1948. And let us also not forget Israel's international birth certificate, which again was validated by God's original promise to Abraham and stamped to fruition by Joshua himself. For the ancient history of the land of Israel included several centuries in which the land was governed by the Jewish people, and note this, my friends, not the Palestinians. Yet if you did watch part 1, you may remember when I discussed several key archaeological finds that literally affirm Israel's claim to the land. And here now in part 2 of this series, let me focus on one key example, which includes Joshua, that you need to be made aware of. For it was on the Jewish New Year of Rosh Hashanah in September of 2023 that the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, otherwise known as UNESCO, passed a resolution recognizing a Palestinian heritage site, that being the ancient city of Jericho, which ultimately thus looks to erase all references to the Jewish and ancient biblical history. For after Moses' death, Joshua was granted by God to lead the Jewish people into the promised land, of which the first city the Bible tells us they conquered was the city of Jericho, as told to us in the book of Joshua. Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out and none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand, with its king and mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war, going around the city once, that you shall do for 6 days." And when they marched around the city on into the 7th day, the priests blew their trumpets, and the people gave a mighty shout, doing exactly as Joshua commanded them. And the walls of Jericho crumbled down, allowing the soldiers to enter and take the city, destroying it completely. And I know there's someone out there right now saying, Ed, that's just a simple biblical fairy tale with no basis in fact. But I would say, is it? For archaeologists have uncovered burnt layers at Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. For numerous jars of burned grain were found in the remains of the Canaanite homes, affirming the biblical description of the battle occurring in the spring of that year. And excavations at Old Testament Jericho have revealed 2 city walls, an inner wall and an outer wall. Each consisted of a stone retaining wall with a mud brick wall built on top of it. Each wall consisted of a stone revetment with a mud brick wall on top of it. In fact, excavations have even revealed that the mud bricks from the collapsed walls fell in such a way that they made a ramp against the retaining wall, making it possible for the Israelites to go up into the city just as described in the scripture. And I could go on, my friends, with several other finds at the Jericho site. But let us not also forget a most important biblical prophecy which came to us via the prophet Jeremiah, of whom spoke this. Instead, they will say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the people of Israel back to their own land from the land of the north and from the land and from all the countries to which he had exiled them. For I will bring them back to this land that I gave their forefathers. And that's exactly what the Lord did on May the 14th of 1948. So in other words, the Israelites, the Jews, are exactly in the land they're supposed to be as ordained for them by God, and it is never going to be the Palestinians or anyone else's for the taking. So my friends, I hope you have now learned some facts from fiction today as to why the Jewish people do have a rightful claim to their land, and also unlike any other nation in history. For it was given to them by the God of Israel, their Jewish king. And so with that said, I want to invite you back for part 3 in this series, where again I will look to provide fact from fiction from today's narrative, which is Palestine has always been an Arab land, and the Balfour Declaration did not give the Jews a right to a reestablishment of their nation within the borders of their old one. Therefore, my friends, you will not want to miss next week's exciting part 3 in this series. And hey, if you're new to the channel and you happen to like what you saw today, hey, do me a favor, comment, like, and subscribe, and share so that I can get the message of the fact versus the fiction out to the masses. So again, until I see all of you next time, my friends, from Appointed to Promote and me, Ed Walsh, God bless.